Welcome to the Acura RSX Coilover Installation Instructions Guide. This detailed walkthrough will provide step-by-step instructions to ensure a smooth and successful installation. We've included the recommended tools, precise torque specs straight from the manufacturer, and other essential tips to help you along the way. Before beginning the installation, measure the distance from the center of each wheel to the fender for both the front and rear. Determine your desired ride height adjustment, then write down these measurements for reference. Safely lift the vehicle using the designated jack points. Remove the wheels using a 19mm socket. Unbolt the brake line bracket by removing the two bolts with a 10mm and 12mm socket. Remove the cotter pin and unbolt the tie rod using a 19mm socket. Use a tie rod separator to detach the tie rod. Remove the lower mount using a 22mm socket and a 19mm wrench. Keep the spindle positioned close to the engine to prevent the axle from popping out of its placement. Remove the top hat nuts with a 14mm socket and take out the strut. The OEM strut measures 17.5 inches from the center of the top hole of the lower mount to the top hat. To achieve a 1-inch drop, adjust the Type 1 coilover to 14.5 inches. Do not adjust ride height using the spring perches, as they are intended for spring preload adjustment only. Install the coilover and hand tighten the top hat nuts. Torque the lower mount bolts using a 22mm socket and a 19mm wrench to 115 pound-feet. Install the tie rod and torque the nut to 40 pound-feet with a 19mm socket. After installing the tie rod, secure it by inserting the cotter pin to prevent any loosening. Reattach the brake line bracket and torque it down using a 10mm socket to 7.7 pound-feet and a 12mm socket to 16 pound-feet. Use a spanner wrench to lock the lower mount into place. Torque the top hat nuts with a 17mm socket to 33 pound-feet. Reinstall the wheels and torque the lug nuts to 80 pound-feet. This concludes the front coilover installation. Remove the trunk trim by first taking out the trunk floor trim, followed by the rear trim, and finally the two side pieces. Loosen but do not remove the top hat nuts using a 14mm socket. A swivel socket adapter will be needed to remove the top hat nut closest to the front of the vehicle. Remove the rear wheels with a 19mm socket. Use a jack to support the lower control arm. Remove the lower mount bolt using a 17mm socket. Use a pry bar to remove the strut from its position. Then remove the top hat nuts to fully take out the strut. The OEM strut measures 13.5 inches from the top hat to the eyelet. Adjust the coilover to the desired height. This setup was set to 11.5 inches. If adjusting the coilover to its highest setting, ensure at least 1 inch of thread engagement in the lower mount for secure fastening. Position the coilover into place and hand tighten the two top hat nuts. Insert the lower mount bolt and torque it to 45 pound-feet. Torque the two top hat nuts to 43 pound-feet using a 14mm socket. Mount the wheels and torque the lug nuts to 80 pound-feet. The final measurement from the center of the wheel to the fender is 13.5 inches in both the front and rear. This completes the RSX coilover installation. An alignment is recommended 1 week after installation to allow the suspension to settle properly.